All right. We've got about 13 people watching. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Peeper Prowl. I'm Amber, and I am going to be moderating with questions and hosting this evening. And we have Stephen out in the field, and he is down at the wetland by 9 Mile Run. And he is going to be telling us a little bit about what's going on, and hopefully we'll get to hear some peepers. Take it away, Stephen.
All right, thanks, Amber. Good evening, everyone. So nice of you to join me here down in the wetlands by 9 Mile Run in Frick Park here in the city of Pittsburgh. And I'm out here tonight looking and listening for an incredible amphibian and one of the many signs that spring has finally arrived. I'm out here looking for the spring peeper. So this is a tiny frog native to most of Eastern North America. And they live in wooded areas where there are seasonal pools or wetlands that they can reproduce in. So these frogs are just beginning to break dormancy and become active again as the weather warms and spring arrives. So once the soil temperatures start to get above 45 degrees or so, these frogs will literally thaw and become alive again after having spent the winter frozen with ice crystals forming inside of their body. It feels like a pretty wild thing to say that a living thing can literally freeze, thaw, and resume pretty much normal metabolic activity over a couple of days. But spring peepers are able to do that, as well as several other species of frogs and even some turtles here in North America. So they're able to do this incredible feat by producing chemicals that are cryoprotectants. So there are things like glucose in the case of the spring peeper, or glycerol in the case of some other amphibians. And they are able to help prevent the cells of these organisms from forming ice inside of them and also from dehydrating. So ice crystals will form outside of the individual cells within the spring peeper as winter sets in and the temperatures begin to drop. Pretty amazing thing these peepers are able to do. So anyway, I'm out here in the wetland, and yesterday was the first time that I heard any peepers active anywhere in the Pittsburgh area. I've been out a couple times this spring looking for amphibians. You know, a couple weeks ago, we had a good thaw and some rain. So I went out looking, but it wasn't time yet. The soil wasn't warm enough. In fact, the place I went, there was still ice on the pond. But with the warm weather this week, the soil temperatures have finally gotten warm enough. And with a little bit of rain that we have coming today, it won't be long until wetlands and seasonal pools or vernal pools in woodlands all over the Pittsburgh region begin to fill up with these tiny little frogs, as well as other amphibians. So in the background there, I just began to hear some little peeps. Maybe you heard some of them. So these little tiny frogs, I mean, they are tiny. They're the smallest frog native to the Pittsburgh area. And they're about the size of a quarter when they're fully grown. Females can be a little bit larger. And they're tiny, but they are mighty. They produce an incredibly loud call. And when a lot of them, another one just peeped. Ah, I just love to hear it. So they produce a very loud sound, especially for their body size. In fact, I think it might be the most decibels per weight sound produced by any animal. So they're able to produce sounds that are about 90 decibels in volume. And most people might not know what that means or what that compares to. That's about as loud as a lawnmower or a jackhammer. So if you were to put your ears up close to a spring peeper, it would be about as loud as a lawnmower or a jackhammer. Pretty darn loud. So anyway, these calls that they're producing are to serve many, many different purposes. But in the springtime, they have mainly one thing on their mind. They are traveling from the woodlands where they spend their summers and falls living in the trees to wet areas like this wetland I'm in down here by 9 Mile Run to lay their eggs. So you can see right here, this wetland is actually pretty dry right now. Normally, I'm not able to walk out here without some pretty heavy duty waterproof boots on. But today I was able to just wear my normal hiking boots. The water level's pretty low. And I'm wondering if that might be playing into why there aren't as many peepers out yet as well. Perhaps they're still waiting for the rains. But yeah, so they rely on these pools that are seasonally wet because these pools aren't able to support fish and other predators that would eat their eggs. So these temporary vernal pools are super, super important for amphibian reproduction because they don't have predators that would consume their eggs. And that also means there's an abundance of other foods that might not be found where fish are present. Things like fairy shrimp and all other different kinds of invertebrates. I've noticed a ton of spiders crawling around out here. Whoa. I don't know if you were able to hear that, but way off in the distance, I just heard a great horned owl calling. I know we're here to talk about peepers, but that was pretty cool too. So keep your ears
That's super
listening.
Cool.
Keep your ears listening for the great horned owl as we're out here exploring. They say, who cooks or who's awake? Me too. Ooh, 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 ooh. Oh, I'm wrong. It was not a great horned owl. That was the barred owl. Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you all? So they sound fairly similar, especially with a lot of traffic noise in the background. But yeah, that was a barred owl. That's the first time I've ever heard a barred owl here in Frick Park. And I'm sharing it with the world. That's pretty cool. Anyway, back to our regularly scheduled programming. I'm gonna go walk around out here and see if we can track down some of these tiny little frogs. Now, it is pretty rare that you're actually able to see them. They're so small and so camouflaged that I've only ever really seen them when they're out in great numbers and it's actively raining and it's warm and they're just too focused on calling and reproducing to really care too much about some large human towering over them with a headlamp. shining artificial lights on them. So that's the only time I've really been able to see them in person. And we're not quite there yet. If it was actively raining right now, it might be a different story. So I'm going to turn the camera around here and just give you a little tour of the wetland here, show you some of the plants that are hanging out, and look for frogs. Whoop.
And I'm going to take this moment to just let everybody know that if you're with your, for the people that are out there watching, if you have any questions that you want to ask, I'm keeping an eye on the chat on Facebook, and I will relay them to Stephen. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask them.
So you can see where I'm at here. There is some water pooled. And there's just masses of cattails here. So cattails are a wetland indicator species of plant. They grow these little things, these little flowers and seed pods on them that those owls are still calling. That's awesome. So here's a little cattail flower seed pod, and it looks almost like a little corn dog on a stick. Cool little plants. So yeah, they are a wetland indicator. We're out here in this wetland. And there are some peepers out here calling. It almost sounds like there's two barred owls calling. I don't know if you're still able to hear them.
I don't know if we are, because I don't think I've heard any of them, but maybe someone has. So we do have a question, and that question is, what do the spring peepers do when it gets cold again? So tomorrow it's supposed to be about 27 at night.
Yeah, that is a great question. And that's definitely something that a lot of people wonder about spring peepers and some of these other frogs, like wood frogs, that are coming out this time of year to reproduce and lay their eggs. And they're able to maintain some of their cryoprotectant abilities, which beyond just the glucose also includes some extracellular proteins and other things going on at the biochemical level. So they're able to maintain that until they start feeding, like eating a lot. So I think most of these frogs kind of delay eating until they've begun to reproduce. So I think because they delay eating, they're able to keep those cryoprotectants active. And if it does start to freeze again, they can just slip back into that dormant state and survive the temporary freeze. they've been living this way for thousands and thousands of years, and so they've evolved to handle temperamental springs that shift between warm and cold.
And will they peep all throughout the night? Like how long will they peep for?
Yeah, that's another great question. When it reaches peak mating time, they'll be active calling pretty much 24/7 if conditions are right. But right now, since it's just the beginning, they might not be super amped up yet. And they'll probably just call periodically throughout the night, and they'll stop sometime around sunrise. For instance, when I got here tonight, they were not calling yet. I got here about 45 minutes or so before the sun went down, and they just weren't active. But as soon as it started to get dark, I started to hear some peeps.
We've got a lot of really good questions coming in.
Sweet.
So someone would like to know what some of their defense mechanisms are.
Defense mechanisms. Well, I would say their primary defense would be camouflage. I wish I could catch one to show you what they look like. I guess you could look at the picture in Amber's background. Yeah, so they're kind of brownish, grayish in color, and that helps them really blend in with the vegetation. This time of year is, mostly dead. It's what's left over from last growing season, so they kind of blend in with that. It also helps them blend in with tree bark, which is their primary background. Through the summer and fall, they're up in the trees. They're a type of tree frog.
So is climate change impacting spring peepers? And if yes, how?
A juicy question. I mean, climate change is impacting us all, whether we'd like to admit it or not. And so I'm certain it is impacting the spring peepers. I believe the biggest difference people are noticing in peepers is that they're emerging earlier and their breeding season is changing. But if you really think about all of the other things they're connected to, like they rely on all of these invertebrates for food. And they rely on these seasonal pools to breed in. So if there are changes in the amount of rainfall places get, if places experience extreme droughts, the water table might not be high enough to keep these seasonal pools wet long enough for them to lay their eggs, and then for their eggs to become tadpoles and continue their growth cycle to adults that become terrestrial again. And then with their food sources, they're eating mostly invertebrates. Oh, here's a cool spider. Let's see if I can flip this around. Speaking of invertebrates. Here's a tiny little spider hanging out right there. And so insects are a lot more sensitive to changes in like the average temperature. Their larvae and pupa, as they develop, are really sensitive to temperature changes. So insects are emerging much earlier than they normally do. And so if the peepers' food sources are emerging earlier or maturing more quickly, then there might not be food for their larvae in these habitats.
And are they in just Pennsylvania, in like our area, or are they located in like other states?
They are all over. They're from, oh, yes. Love it. So there's about 6 peepers peeping right now. They spread from Florida up into Canada and west to the Rockies pretty much. So pretty widespread.
Do the males and females look the same, or do they have differences?
They look pretty much the same. I think females are a little bit larger than males, and that's the only difference I know offhand. I would need to research that further. But they all have this X pattern across their back. Their Latin name is Pseudacris crucifer, which means false locust crossbearer. So false locust because people thought they sounded kind of like the locusts or like insects, and crossbearer because they have that X pattern on their back.
So we have about roughly 5 minutes left. We have about 2 more questions that I can see right now. Do they need to stay wet? And how do they stay wet up in the trees?
Yeah, so all amphibians rely on a certain level of moisture, especially for breathing. In fact, there are some salamanders that don't even have lungs. They breathe entirely through their skin. But these frogs, they have lungs, so they can breathe air just like us. But they also have cutaneous respiration, or breathing through their skin. So yeah, they need to stay somewhat damp. Luckily, in the summertime, it's pretty humid here, so they don't dry out very quickly. And you maybe notice that dew often collects in the morning or overnight. And so they're able to find dew in the canopy and use that to help stay damp. So they need it to be humid, somewhat moist, rain occasionally. So you won't find them in arid environments, but there are amphibians that adapt even to desert environments. They're pretty resilient.
And the last question that I've got here is, how long do peepers live?
Another great question. So I'll run through the whole life cycle. I realized I didn't talk at all about that. So they will lay their eggs here in a couple weeks. The eggs will take a week or 2 to hatch into a larval tadpole, and that will swim around in this wetland for 90 to 100 days before it becomes a mature frog. It takes them another year before they reach sexual maturity, and they can live for several years beyond that. I think the average age of a spring peeper in the wild is about 3 years old. I'm not sure exactly what the maximum age is, but they can live for a little while.
All right. And you had wanted to close us out with just kind of a minute of just listening, right?
I think so. Yeah. So I just wanted to say thank you all for joining me here tonight in the wetlands of Frick Park. My name is Stephen, I'm a naturalist at the Frick Environmental Center, and this has been a Peeper Prowl. So I'm going to try to get a little closer to where these frogs are calling from, and I'm just going to let the video go for a little bit. Hopefully we'll hear some peeps. Thanks for joining. Hope to see you in the park sometime.
The peepers only want to talk when you're talking.
I guess so, huh? So be it. It is still quite a tranquil evening down here in the wetland, whether the peepers grace us with their songs or not.
Were you trying to call for them?
Perhaps.
Oh.
Well, seems they're not being cooperative. So thanks, and we'll see you some other time.
Thanks for joining us, everybody. Have a good night.